Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tradecraft Tuesday. Today joining us to discuss the Verizon incident response breach is Dan Guido, as well as Chris Bisnett and myself, Kyle Hansloven. As always, we do this live noon every Tuesday. And with that said, we're going to jump right into news this week.
Yep. So a quick shameful plug here. Kyle and I will be out of Black Hat teaching a course on fuzzing. So if you want to learn how to find bugs, come take that course. It'll be a good time. So probably the biggest news this week was VirusTotal's cracking down on a lot of the people using their API. So one of the things that they kind of cited out and really pointed out was that there are some AV engines that are not really doing their own work. They're just kind of waiting to see what other people report on new files in VirusTotal and then marking those specific files as bad, which really isn't doing anything, right? You're just like using other people's information for your own good. So they're cracking down on some stuff like that. Some people have lost access. Like Sentinel-1 came out and wrote a blog post about how they're losing access to the VirusTotal API, which is kind of bad. I think it's a good thing to have for like the community to be able to rally around it. But basically, VirusTotal's thing was, if you're not adding back into the service, you're just getting stuff for free. So
I think that's what I caught in their blog, right? It was not just, hey, you're using it and only using it, right? It was the not sharing. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, I think they really try to do like one of two things. Either you pay them for the data that you do get, or you share equivalent data with them. Like, the whole reason VirusTotal was set up was, to get new samples into the hands of antivirus vendors. And then, for their troubles, they would basically give back whether, thumbs up or thumbs down, whether or not the file was good or bad. So yeah.
I wonder if this will be like their Google Reader moment. If, after Google shuts down access to VirusTotal for so many people, if a lot of new competitors are going to spring up in its wake.
That's a good point.
A number of people have mentioned things like Quarks Labs Irma, which lets you run a VirusTotal-like system inside your company.
Yeah.
But as for like a public aggregation system, I don't know if there's anyone in particular that's as large as VirusTotal. So it'll be interesting to see how people react.
Yeah. I think there's like OpsSWAT who has like a similar type of service, but who knows? Maybe they'll get a bunch of new customers.
Yeah, I don't know anybody that scale VirusTotal, but I did find both of the ones you guys just mentioned, ironically, when I looked myself.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Pretty big shakeup though, I guess. Real quick, if you were interested in looking at malware samples, the Mikko Hipponen basically set up some stuff on archive.org where they have what they call the malware museum. So you can go and check out. Mostly what's on there is like really old DOS malware. So they're kind of fun to look at, just like see what it would have been like, to get pwned way back in the day. Also, IBM is trying to train Watson to detect cybersecurity. So this could be interesting. I don't know. They've had some successes before, I guess, with like training it how to like read cancer reports and aggregate the data and stuff like that. So I guess we'll see what they can do with like cybersecurity. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath, but Watson works for the other side. Yeah.
I think there's certainly some problems it can contribute to, but I think this gets to the heart of the topic we're going to discuss later, that you really need a practitioner's detailed input in order to make use of it. I think the future for a lot of these AI techniques are AI paired with a human. It's not AI operating on its own, but it's AI accelerating a task that a human was already doing.
Right. Yeah, you're really going to only have as good outputs as you have inputs, so if your input data is like vague or bad or just missing things, like, I don't know, it's going to be difficult to come out on the other end with something good and useful.
As far as I know, this is how they use Watson for medical diagnoses as well. They don't have, Watson going off and running a doctor's office on its own. They give every single doctor like a phone a friend, and that phone a friend provides them additional input to make their diagnosis, but it doesn't replace it.
Nice.
So
that could be interesting then.
Yeah. I would love to have Watson helping me out, like sitting next to me and assisting with things that I'm working on. That would probably be the ideal situation.
Oh yeah, that'd be fantastic. I don't know what you'd have to pay for that though.
Well, probably marginal costs are nothing. That's why it's so attractive. So maybe it's pennies. Who knows?
That'd be slick.
Yeah.
No more Bang Mona or whatever. I can just go off and say, hey Watson, go take care of this for me. You know,
Watson construct my ROP chain. Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about.
This could go sideways quick.
Alrighty, but I mean, leading the news over the last 2 weeks. Maybe not leading the news, but Verizon's data breach investigations report has been all over. A lot of positive, a lot of negative, and a lot of kind of indifferent. If I recall right, Verizon's been doing this investigation report for like 9 years or 10 years.
2008.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, gosh, that is insane how time has flown by. But the overall, right, the point is supposed to be some sort of metric or some sort of pulse on like, hey, this is what data breaches look like throughout the year, right? I mean, is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have probably the single largest data set that I've seen a vendor work with, where they have somehow convinced 60 or more organizations to donate their incident reports to them. So they have really hard data on what kinds of compromises and data breaches have occurred and what people have done about them and what people have found. And I think it's really unique because where so many other reports are, marketing dressed up as engineering information, the Verizon report has always aired on a different side, where it's been a really useful tool if you work on an enterprise security team.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost no marketing in there. That you're not going to read a section that says like, "Oh, you could have prevented this if you just bought this product."
Right.
I definitely would argue less marketing or less highlighting of stuff than some of the others, right? However, I think I won't say it's biased, right? But I will say this year's analysis in particular was the first time that I recall maybe more than one person saying that, hey, the analyses might not have been as spot on as it could have been, or might not have reflected. I kind of had it within the first paragraph of the DBIR, the executive summary, and started wondering, are all these necessarily reflective of what I've seen? And not saying that I am, in any way, shape, or form more qualified than Verizon and their 60, contributing companies. But I did find it really interesting, just jumping into it, when they started talking about external breach discovery, right? It sounded like a lot of web apps were getting pwned. No surprise there. So with that said, I mean, it was exciting. Law enforcement was saying, hey, web apps are getting pwned. Commercial sector was saying, hey, web apps are getting pwned. However, one of the first things that kind of caught me off guard was when they started talking about their top 10, dangerous attacks of the year. I mean, any stick out to you, Chris or Dan, that kind of threw you for a loop?
I don't know, nothing from my end. I think everything looked great.
Everything looked great, huh?
I will say this. I mean, I was looking at the numbers that they put out for the different types of attacks and stuff, and somehow crimeware showed up as only a couple of percent down from like 15% last year, and maybe that doesn't include ransomware. I don't know, because ransomware seems to be pretty prevalent to me and only increasing.
Yeah, so, I think it's a huge unacknowledged problem with the Verizon data set that year to year they get many different contributors giving them data. And, they have a very large rise in web app attacks as an overall percentage of the data set this year. But that could be because just one particular vendor or one particular IR company had a lot of work in that area. Or they're using a particular tool or some kind of technique that finds all those issues. So does this represent the global perspective? Does this represent what's inside my company? I don't know, because it's biased by who finds it and who's contributing.
That's a good point.
And it was pretty interesting. They even kind of, it was subtle, but there was definitely a disclaimer saying, hey, because our contributing partners change every year, you can't necessarily take a look at the 2015 breach report and take a look at our 2016 and then compare and contrast that data, because it might not be comparing apples to apples.
There's one particular graph. It's figure 19. I don't know on what page, but it's this like stacked bar chart kind of sort of where they show the change in different incident types over the years they've been producing the report. And you can see that they've got on top of it a disclaimer where they say, the fact that our data set is constantly evolving with contributors joining, yay, and others not being able to participate for a year means that, certain data associated with the victim industry might change. So it's kind of funny where they are presenting these as like, analysis that you can use, but at the same time, they're hedging their bets on a lot of it. And they're saying, well, we acknowledge there's some problems with the way we're presenting this.
Right.
So to get back, I mean, not to harp on like individual points here, but to get back, I think one of the things that I've observed from the Verizon data breach report in the years that I've been reading it, and I think the first one I read was in 2009. I think I missed the first year. Is that it really represents, I think, the status quo at this point. There was a time when a lot of the recommendations they made were bleeding edge, and there were things that the company that I worked for at the time, the Federal Reserve, and other companies that I consulted with after, just weren't doing those things. But I haven't really seen a lot of flexibility or a lot of ambition in the way that they deal with these issues. And that's kind of the biggest problem with me, because a lot of companies, I go to a lot of conferences, and when I go to any conference that has to do with enterprise security, there's always a panel on the data breach, the data breach investigations report. And there are people out there that take these recommendations at face value and do them, and that drives their security spending for the next year. And I think that there's a lot of gains. Both of you guys as pen testers are really well equipped to know what makes your life hell when you're on an engagement, when you're trying to access some data and you just can't.
Right.
And I really see that, this is kind of just more of the same. It's starting to get tired. And I want to know what's next for the Verizon data breach investigations report. Like, the format hasn't really changed dramatically in the whole time that it's been printed. And it's starting to feel tired to me.
Oh, that's crazy different perspective. When I read this, usually each year, I have a bias for particular tradecraft and trends, making sure that I'm armed for, whatever conversation with a CISO or something like that is going to have with me. Somebody else who pulled away and said, "Hey, I'm gonna beef up my expertise this year. I'm gonna read the DBIR," and so most of my time it's just arming myself so I can say, "Hey, from my professional expertise, what I've seen in a breach or what I've seen from offensive or defensive side may or may not align with this report." But I've never once considered that maybe the report itself could use some shaking up, which is a pretty wild perspective. Not jumping too far away from that, but I just tried to post the lovely picture here of figure 19. So for anybody who's following along there, that's the figure that Dan was referring to earlier.
I don't even know how to read that. What does that mean?
It's just a pretty picture. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. What it does indicate is it indicates that this particular metric is useless. It indicates that from year to year, the number and the type of contributions that they get vary so dramatically that the overall trend data just can't show through.
I have a really hard time buying that POS systems and payment card skimmers are like nil in the last couple years. No.
Yeah.
That's not true. I mean, I just saw like news articles like last week and the week before, and I think we even reported on them that like now that chip and pin is coming in, people are just trying to make the one last mad dash, trying to just hit all pause systems and stuff they can before chip and pin
Clock's ticking.
Is really everywhere.
Yeah, man. Clock's ticking. You gotta get that data now.
Yeah, so like I have a hard time believing it's a zero or next to zero. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think weren't you guys saying something about a reduction in the volume of exploit kits over the last year or two or something?
There's definitely
they definitely said that.
Yeah, I mean, I really, as you guys all observed, I really hyper focused on that vulnerability section in the beginning. So I've started to forget what's in the rest of the report at this point. But yeah, the exploit kit thing, I don't know exactly how to back that up with data right now. I haven't read the SBIR, not the SBIR, the SIR. Everybody's got all these acronyms. The Microsoft Security Intelligence Report, I think, is much more authoritative on that subject because they've got one mega population of users, and that's everybody that runs Windows. So it's a little bit easier to draw inferences from it. And I don't know exactly what they said, but I think some of the trends that I've observed as somebody that knows about exploits and software security is that I don't really remember the last time that somebody put fully functioning browser exploit code on the internet that could just get plugged into a kit and used. And my gut tells me that the effectiveness of these kits is probably dropping pretty dramatically over time.
Yeah. They're pretty far down. There was one maybe like 2 weeks ago. There was some Flash exploit stuff, some actual Flash O-Day that was in what's that big exploit kit?
You talking about Angler?
Yeah, the Angler.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So So that was interesting, although they didn't quite do it right, and it wasn't. They were checking some things that were wrong, and so in some cases it wouldn't actually land, even though like if they used the other version, it would have landed. So there was some stuff in there, but I think for the most part, the exploit kits are still doing like macros on Word docs and junk like that.
Yeah, I think I like to divide the world into exploit consumers and exploit producers, and the exploit kit people are definitely exploit consumers. The only guy that was a producer is sitting in a Russian jail right now, and that's Punch. Right?
Yeah, right.
You heard about that. They came down hard on him, and he got like 10 years in prison or something.
Yeah, we just talked about that last week a little bit. That came up in our news. Like,
he was the only innovator in that entire market. There are a lot of people playing and a lot of people just reskinning control panels, not actually providing new exploits. But, I think on the other side, on the defensive side, you've just got purchase cycles that, have lasted for quite a bit longer than people expected. Like, people haven't gotten rid of all their Windows XP boxes and whatnot, but it's 2016 now, and those are going away. Overwhelmingly, people go out to the store or companies buy new hardware, and it comes with Windows 10 on it. And when you've got Windows 10, you've got a flash sandbox. You've got low integrity, protecting your flash exploit payload. And just by doing that with no other defensive anything, any kind of maneuvering, you're protected from a lot of these kits. So maybe I would actually agree that some of the exploit kit data is going down relative to other attacks that are more successful.
Yeah, that is a wild perspective. Because I think about last year's and maybe the last couple years of the Verizon reports, and the trend that I can closely relate to what we just described with the exploits was kind of the amount of code running in the kernel, right? I mean, since NC6, ASLR becoming more readily available, some of the control flow guard, implementations and protections that have been implemented, like the requirement of signing drivers, kernel execution went down in malcode, significantly over the last several years. And I wonder if you're right, Dan. I wonder if because of these security, features, when it boils down to it, that's been implemented at the OS or the browser, are just going to kind of continue chipping away at that market, allowing new lower hanging fruit to kind of get picked on.
I think if I were to make a recommendation on the DBIR, the one that I would make is not a security one. I don't want to have to make people turn on feature X or Y. I just say go throw away the hardware that you've got and just buy new stuff. Don't even worry about configuring it the right way. Just throw it away. And if you do that, you're going to avoid so much stuff.
Yeah, a processor running SMEC or something like that, right? That's
just click that little button that says install Windows 10. Just click it. It's been there for a while. It. Just click it.
It's a real problem because I know the perspective of the guys at Microsoft. They can make so much progress and they can implement control flow integrity and they can add all kinds of new kernel protection mechanisms. But the time horizon to getting that into people's hands can be on the order of 5 to 10 years.
Yep,
and
it lags.
If I know you guys, if all of a sudden every single piece of software tomorrow had control flow integrity on it, fuck it. I'll go do something else. You're starting to really tighten the noose on the opportunities that attackers have to exploit most vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that though. I mean, if you look at the rise of non-exploitation attacks, where it's just like, user visits a site, it says, oh my gosh, you have malware, call this number and we'll help you remove it. They call the number. The person basically walks them through installing malware.
Yeah.
No exploit needed. Like that, there's the rise of that is just through the roof.
And that's really important to note because that doesn't mean that you're failing. That means that the attackers have shifted to a more expensive, like what's their cost per user? Like your advertisers track cost per click and like cost to acquire new clients. Well, what's the cost to acquire a new client when you have to call them on the phone versus when you can just show them an ad that's malicious and exploit their browser directly, right? So you're starting to move your way up the value chain here and you're making attackers try harder to get the same results or rather to get worse results. I would gather that less people fall for a phone call than fall for a silent browser exploit.
Right.
So did you see the point that Laura made, ironically? The same old excuses over and over of like, hey, I can't upgrade my OS, or, oh, we can't afford new hardware. I would argue, I think your point is pretty darn accurate, Dan. Like if, you don't have to upgrade if your new hardware comes with it, for instance, right? If it comes with, I guess they're still shipping 2012 R2. But whether it's server or workstations in the Windows environment, like just buy new hardware. It's probably cheaper than the cost to upgrade, plus the added benefits. It's refreshing your life cycle, the hardware. That's actually a pretty slick recommendation. I'm surprised more pragmatic recommendations aren't made like that more often.
It's kind of a funny confluence of the whole DevOps mentality with security, where if you have a repeatable deploy process, then you have some assurance that you can reboot that server, right? So I think as more people start to adopt these modern techniques for managing their infrastructure, it'll be a lot easier to move past these excuses like, oh, I can't reboot it. Well, I can, if I can programmatically deploy it with Vagrant, well, who cares if I can't reboot it? I can make a new one in like a minute.
Right.
So what else? I hate to keep harping on the vulnerability stuff in the in the data breach report. What else did you guys find interesting?
So it was actually one of the parts, which is, there's a lot more to the report, right? The report is 85 pages long. But I actually found kind of their appendix. I think it was in Appendix F, they have the year in review timeline, which was interesting about it because some of this year in review already talked about things that we already mentioned. For instance, in January, they say, hey, new Adobe Flash O Day started getting spread via Angler in in January. And then if you look throughout the year, some of those trends about the building crime, where building more and more moved to phishing, right? That's kind of almost in this report starts looking at what we just said, that, hey, browser exploits did not become such a fantastic initial way of getting execution. It actually moved closer and closer towards what it looks like, good old-fashioned social engineering, phishing, and then clearly the move towards macros and everything. Macros all the way down for delivering initial infections.
I guess some data that agrees with that too is the ransomware community has also moved to web exploits. A lot of the information that I've been seeing lately shows Java deserialization and JBoss and application server exploits being used to directly compromise big data stores for companies and then encrypting it and holding it ransom. That's a really strange movement. Wow. And it tells me that maybe maybe we're right. Maybe there is a lot of pressure on the client side all of a sudden, with more people upgrading to newer platforms and less browser exploits being released readily available.
What's wild is I've seen the same thing. Actually, more than one, pen tester or I guess somebody who's doing analysis from a defensive perspective, come into a network and say, oh, hey, once again, another, heaven forbid, JBoss, or I think Jenkins was even something recently of people getting popped through.
Jenkins is not fun.
Jenkins is not fun. I deal with that almost daily right now, and but no mention in the report at all. And I don't know if maybe that eclipsed the 2015 timeline, 2016, and maybe that's just new. In their timeline, they stopped with kind of the black energy attack and some of the sexiness behind the Ukrainian SCADA attack.
Let's see what else we got here.
Yeah, I'm flying through right now.
So I'll say there was a section sort of in the beginning, I guess. They were talking about detection time and how the time between like when someone's actually compromised and when someone actually detects compromise is increasing, and that's a trend that we've seen reported before. I think there was a report last year by was it FireEye?
It's Mandiant's 2015 and 2016 reports went from 200 days to 146. Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah. So there was that, and then there was like kind of like a side comment, or I guess there was like another chart where they were talking about how organizations are even detecting that they're breached, and more it was like third parties were notifying them, either police or journalists or whoever.
Yeah. So from my perspective as a researcher, Trailovitz works on research and development projects. I don't do a whole lot of like hands-on pen testing and stuff anymore. There's a lot of projects out there that are funding research into automatic network exploitation. You've got projects like Plan X that gives you the visualization tools to automatically move around the network. You've got the CyberGrant Challenge, which gives you the tools to automatically create the entry methods that you're going to use for each individual hop along the network. And I think this is a really good leading indicator for where attacks could go in the future, and maybe already are. As you've got better tools like all the kinds of endpoint detection and response, attackers need to respond with the exact same kind of automation when they're actually routing around to try and find the data they want to exfiltrate. The time when you can just sit down, hands on the keyboard, and write one instruction and make spelling mistakes is starting to disappear for those networks that are well defended. So I wonder if this is a trend we'll see.
Yeah.
Or how quickly we'll see it, rather. Not whether we will, but how quickly it'll come.
Yeah.
So while we're chatting, I went and found a part of the report which I thought was interesting. And rather than picking on anything, I think they actually did a fairly good job with the amount of data that they had. It seemed to be fairly heavy on just raw information about phishing, and specifically how often some of the folks that were responding to an incident could correlate with that initial phishing attack being the initial access that helped an attacker get in. And some of those were ridiculously high. I'll post this here in the chat, but as I'm reading it right now, one of the things that they mentioned, although they don't say how many total attacks, obviously that's kind of hard, but they say roughly 9,500 total incidents that they were able to attribute to phishing. And of those, 900 or so confirmed that data disclosure was as a result. If you think about that, that's a pretty high number of the amount of from their data set alone. If 9,500 of these total incidents were a result of phishing, and 10% of them result in data disclosure, that seems like somewhere I would be putting some investment, whether that's investment in people, the latest technology, etc. I mean, because that's something that new hardware, right? It's not going to fix.
Not really. You got to be smart. That requires some actual thinky. You can't just sit down and train people and expect that the number will go to zero.
Yeah,
right.
That's a topic that I really harp on a lot, and I actually put a lot of I put money behind it. The first product that we launched at Trail of Bits, which failed, but the first product that I launched at Trail of Bits was an automated waterhole and phishing simulation framework, so that we would rapidly attack a company with these phishing campaigns and adjust to the defenses that they implemented so they could see what worked and what didn't. And what overwhelmingly doesn't work, and my perspective on this, what overwhelmingly doesn't work is training. You only have to send a few more emails to get the same response rate, and you can be sneakier about it, and the response rates go up. The real issue here is that people are vulnerable to phishing at all. And the things they need to do to mitigate against that are things like two-factor authentication. Things are separating maybe an internal and an external email address, or filtering your mail somehow that strips out data or instructions that could be used to trick people or exploit them. I've seen a lot of things like Proofpoint, I think, is the one big vendor that a lot of the enterprises use to transparently rewrite links and attachments in all their incoming mail. And that's pretty formidable for a phishing defense. Not to recommend any particular vendor. I know they have competitors as well, but I've just seen them used more often. What do you guys think are actual good responses to phishing? Because the status quo is clearly not working.
Yeah. I don't do engagements half as much as I used to. It just haven't had time for them. But I can't think of an engagement that I did do in 2015 or 2016 where sadly phishing wasn't the initial access. Very rarely did anybody ever have to earn their way on. Most of the other times it was through a web app. And for each of these organizations, whether government or commercial, there's plenty of user education. So I completely agree. User education is not cutting it. I have not seen a solid way, because it's that cat and mouse game. About the time I see somebody that is doing a very efficient job, I can't even recall the vendor's name, but I did see a presentation earlier this year, which what blew me away was the technology that they employed to be able to find these embedded, maybe the macro that's embedded within a Word file, that's within a encrypted zip file that's password protected. And their software was OCRing the password out of the email. And I sat back and I said, are you kidding me? We have users that clearly somebody's writing a technology around this, because we have users that get an email that say, here is this password. Here's how to decrypt this, this zip. On top of it, here's this Word doc. When you get this pop-up about macro security, disregard it and run it anyways. That's a level of...
Yeah, I think there's a couple...
I mean, that's insider threat already.
Yeah, there's a couple things there that I think they're mentioning. The fact that a lot of the controls that people implement are discretionary and that they can bypass them if they feel like it is a problem. Somebody, if you make a corporate policy that somebody shouldn't be able to turn on macros and run executables, then they shouldn't be able to bypass it just because they feel like it that day. And if you need a process where they can do that, the exceptions need to be tracked, and there needs to be some kind of method to audit that log. But also, if it's malware that you're concerned about, there's a lot better defenses to it than simply trying to check and blacklist all the stuff that's coming into your company. There's been a lot of momentum behind products like Carbon Black and Bit9, as well as App Locker that's built into newer versions of Windows. Again, like if you have Windows 10, you can use this. I think that there's a larger trend here that needs to happen, and that maybe already has started, towards immutable devices. The software that you run on your computer should not be general purpose. You have a job, there are certain things that you do for it, they don't change drastically every day, and there's no reason why you should have an arbitrary computation device that can load malware just the same way that you can go download, a new copy of VLC off the internet. And that's something that I wish more people did. And, the easy way to get it, I think, is recommending people go out and try to buy Chromebooks or iPads for situations where they know they can work. But until it's kind of a real pain point for companies, or until it becomes easy enough to deploy on Windows, they're not going to use it.
Yeah, that's funny. Right? Although the iPad might have an argument for a much, I guess even Chromebook has an argument for a secure platform. I really do. I run a lot of my more important stuff off an ARM-based Chromebook, because nobody's writing shellcode or, writing malware to attack I say that. That's when I get popped later this afternoon.
Yeah.
But I think there is something to be said for some of that obscurity right now. In the SMB world of companies, I've seen some folks move to kind of this virtual desktop infrastructure, right? So it's still running on the same pwnable platform, but more and more like type of thin client type connections, or VPNs into, or RDPing straight into a cloud hosted box that gets wiped. It's a standardized
Amazon Workspaces. You can go get a Windows VM up in the cloud that you RDP into that destroys itself every time you shut it down and maintains the data across sessions. And there is absolutely no reason you need anything but a Chromebook to access stuff like that.
Right.
So we kind of, Laura asked a question earlier about Verizon's report, and they estimated $50 to $80 per record, per incident. Okay, per record is specifically what was put in here in the question, versus IBM's cost of $217 per record. I don't have enough data to address some of that head on. Nor do I know what per record means per se, but I will say that I haven't seen any costs in breach remediation going down. Not only are they usually, more and more lawyers now are controlling the breach. Very rarely do I ever hear about the first contact to a incident response company is from the company themselves. Usually it's the lawyers, and when the lawyers are involved, it's usually extremely expensive. On top of it, there might be, to mitigate, future litigation, oftentimes remediation comes with it. So not only did we clean it up, but what is the, what are the mitigations that are put in place to minimize this risk from happening in the future, all from a litigation standpoint. So I don't know what that record means. I don't know if Verizon looks at a different data set than IBM does, or maybe the users change.
It might just be flawed. I mean, if you look at it, they said web app attacks were way up, right? When you hit a web app and you dump their database, I mean, you're going to get a lot of records, right? So if you're getting more records, then I guess the price will be less. But like you said, I mean, it's generally arbitrary, and companies have an incentive to increase the cost, right? Because the cost is really arbitrary. They're just telling the court, like, hey, look, it cost us several $1 million, right? They want to play it up because they want their reputation to be less tarnished by showing themselves as a victim rather than part of the problem, because their passwords weren't encrypted, right? So they have an incentive to kind of blow up that number and make it ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't think that number is really meaningful without context. It's worth $217 based on what you can do with it, right? So what does the record mean to me? What can I do with it? How can I use it to make money? And unless you've got that context, it's really difficult to say. Because what are we talking about? Credit card records? We're talking about health data.
Right.
Health data is extremely hard to monetize. How do you monetize the fact that I got checked out for a cough this morning? Okay, cool. But at the same time, there's
Robitussin ads.
Yeah, that's right. There's a black market for all the Dwayne Reed, pharmacy section. They buy up all the health data and use it to sell me stuff.
So guys, we've already gone roughly 30 minutes, and I think we could probably go 30 more minutes if we needed to on discussing some of the data. Typically in a normal Tradecraft Tuesday episode, we say, hey, here's the shady tradecraft that's being used in the wild, and here's some of the remediations, or here's some of the stuff that a defender or an organization can do in response. So do we have anything like the equivalent for this DBIR? Maybe places to focus on? I think it's pretty clear an investment in phishing, or at least understanding phishing is an important thing, might be up there. But any other things? Vulns, for instance, related? I know that hits real close to home, Dan.
No, I think the one trend that I really want to see is the move towards immutable systems, is the move towards lockdown devices that come in a set configuration and that you can't do much with once you get it. But I'll mention one more thing. There's another initiative to watch, and that's Google's BeyondCorp. Google has another way of dealing with this, where they're looking at the context with which you access data, and that everyone exists on the internet. They're completely disregarding the entire notion that somebody can have a private internet, and they're just putting everybody as these little tiny islands out on the internet, and then basing decisions on whether they can access a certain resource on the context that they access it from. The tools to do that are really not great. You can do it if you're Google, but you can't do it if you're too many other people. But I think the cost to deploy technology like BeyondCorp are only going to go down, especially as Google keeps open sourcing the tools to do it inside their company. So that's one thing that I'm really hopeful for, but the horizon for it is very long.
Yeah. So do you see Prasanna's comment there about BeyondCorp needing multi-factor auth?
Yes, you need multi. Yeah, it's 2016, man. Get with it. You got to have multi-factor auth. The password needs to die. We need to start thinking about challenge response auth. We need to start thinking about trusted systems that you can use to generate crypto keys. And the default of, well, let's just make built-in authentication with passwords just doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah. Cool. Well,
Chris, how about you? Anything 2015 recommendation or anything like that?
I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, upgrading, patching. I mean, you got to do the simple things right. Walk before you run.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no sense in trying to go out there and protect yourself against like APT with all kinds of O-Day and living in memory and all that kind of stuff. If you have bad password reuse and you're still running XP boxes and stuff, like do the simple things first and then go from there.
I'll mention one thing. The way that I like to get better at tasks that you just can't seem to, like patching, is not to patch better, but to avoid patching at all. And kind of a system where you've got transparently delivered updated code, I think, is another one that people need to move to. Internet Explorer Edge updates every 2 weeks in the background now, and they've kind of stolen that model from Chrome.
Yep.
And nobody worries about, did you install the latest Chrome patch to avoid that exploit in the wild, or that IE patch now? So people will be saying that about Edge next. That's the right way to deploy patches, not to improve the cycle that you test them and try and get them out in 1 week instead of 3, or to set up a complicated process. It's to just remove the process altogether. But unfortunately, a lot of the people that need to build that are the vendors themselves. Microsoft needs to turn that corner. Apple needs to turn that corner. But once you do, the payoff is tremendous, because then, who cares if you press the patch button or not? All your software got it anyway.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh wow. So yeah, I think I will leave my 2015 if I won't harp phishing or I won't harp even patching, but I think I would like to see the death of the password. I'm just tired of it. Right? It's sexy that we talk a lot about malware here on this web show, but the reality is the amount of password stolen credentials and the enabling gateway. Like, it's 2016.
The thing my money behind. Yeah, sorry for the Trail of Bits found a way to access the secure enclave inside the iPhone, and we can use that as a factor for authentication that doesn't require a password. It's called Titus. We put it up online.
Nice.
Yeah. Here, feel free. I mean, as we're wrapping this up, if you want to plug a URL or something like in there.
Yeah, so Titus is passwordlessapps.com. We're probably going to start open sourcing bits and pieces of it pretty soon. And, we're very happy for people to look at it. There's a guy named Darth Null that wrote a great blog post about how it works. And it's challenge response. It generates an ECC key inside the TPM, the secure enclave, inside an iPhone. And then it relies on the fingerprint authentication to unlock it, which allows you to sign a challenge and send it back. So you can log into stuff without a user account or without a password, and you're identified based on a machine identifier. This is kind of the same thing that you would do if you had X509 certificates and we're doing client authentication with them, which is another really underutilized technique that I wish, instead of moving to passwords and cookies and other junk like that, I really wish we just fixed the root cause problem, which was the UI around those X509 certs and around SSL client auth, because you'd have a lot easier time if people could just figure out how to make that a little bit more effective.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
So I did drop a link both to both of your blogs, or rather the one that Gruck threw up there, as well as yours yourself. There's a link we posted earlier to the Verizon breach report itself. Other than that, guys, I'm going to wrap it up, and maybe we can go off the record to see if there's any shady questions that anyone wants to ask off the record. Anybody have any last closing remarks?
No.
Cool. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us for Tradecraft Tuesday, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks for having me.
Later.